Hello, it's been a while since we've had a video, so hopefully you remember how this goes. So we are now going to start talking and focusing on the cell membrane, especially the phospholipid bilayer, and how the cell gets nutrients in and out of the cell. Because remember, we've talked about the Golgi apparatus, we spent a little bit of time on the phospholipid bilayer, but now we're going to focus on how and when a cell needs energy to transport in and out of a cell. I forgot to include an objective slide, so in class I'll tell you what you should know after the end of this video. The reading is broken up into two different parts, so this is cell transport and homeostasis, part 1. You will get part 2 in a couple days. Alright, so to start this video, I want you to visualize a house, and visualize this house without windows or doors. And if you're thinking of a house that I'm thinking of, I'm kind of thinking of a cell, right? Something that has no windows and no doors would be something like an entrapped box, if you will. So nothing could enter or leave the house. So if I were to poke holes in the walls, instead of having windows or doors, things could enter or leave the house, but you wouldn't be able to control what comes in or out. Right, we could agree with that. If I'm just trying to get through, anything and everything will get through this hole if there's no way to filter what comes in and what comes out. So if a house has walls with windows and doors, it can be open and closed, and if we don't want a stranger coming into our house, we don't let them in the door, right? If we lock our doors, we lock our windows. That is how we filter who comes in and out of our house. And the cell does that same thing with the phospholipid bilayer. So the phospholipid bilayer is not just this fancy layer, it has a whole bunch of cool features in the fact that it controls what goes in and out of the cell. The plasma membrane moves everything in and out of the cell, like I just said. And there are two ways that this occurs. This can occur through passive transport and active transport. And I'm going to explain what those two things are here in the upcoming slides. We are going to focus more primarily on passive transport in comparison to active transport, which is the next video. Biggest thing I want you to remember is that without this plasma membrane, without the idea of letting things come in and out of a cell, then the whole integrity of the cell could be compromised. And this is how a lot of times bacteria and viruses affect our cells, is that they very easily can overtake a cell because of the fact that your cell has no idea how to regulate what comes in and out of it when a virus has affected it. A lot of times viruses will take over the DNA of a cell, and then there is no filtering of what comes in and out. So again, very important feature when it comes to the survival of a species. Like I said, there are two types of transport when it comes to the cell membrane. We have passive and active. So passive transport occurs when substances cross the plasma membrane without any input of energy from the cell. So what I'm saying is that there's no energy needed for things to pass through. And so these are things that blend well with the cell, that generally don't take much of anything to get through. So no energy is needed because substances are moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. I'd like you to underline that, highlight that. I don't care what you do, but do something so that you know that. I thought that was a highlighter. It turns out it's just, no. But no energy needed because substances are moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And if you don't know what concentration is now, it's okay. We will talk about that in class, and how things of high concentration can't absorb as much as things with low concentration. What I mean by concentration is that concentration is the number of particles of a substance per unit volume. So for example, if I am making Kool-Aid and I put a bunch of sugar in my solution, the concentration of sugar that is absorbed is so much until that solution becomes super saturated, and then there's sugar hanging out at the bottom. So the amount of sugar in my solution, that's what I'm referring to when I say concentration. The more particles of a substance in a given volume, the higher the concentration. So if I add more sugar to my glass of water, the higher the sugar concentration is. And everything, a substance will always move from an area where it is more concentrated to an area where it is less concentrated. Things don't like to be crowded. We don't like to feel stuffed up. So all particles are going to move somewhere where they have a little more room to move around. It's you can also think of it like a ball rolling down a hill. It goes by itself without any input of energy, and so that's a good example of passive transport. It just happens. It doesn't require any type of energy. There are different types of passive transport that I'd like you to know a lot more details on. And so I am going to spend some time talking about each one individually, but right now you should know that there's simple diffusion, number one. Number two is osmosis. And then number three is facilitated diffusion. All right, so simple diffusion is okay. So I guess we need to talk about the idea of diffusion first, because there are different kinds of it. But I want to talk about what diffusion is. So diffusion is the movement of a substance across a membrane due to a difference in concentration without any help from other molecules. So remember when we talked about going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, they are just moving across a membrane from high to low without any help. Substances simply move from high to low, exactly like I said. So many times these substances are very small, they're hydrophobic. Remember that the heads, and I'm going to draw this, so we have our plasma membrane. It's our phospholipid membrane, phospholipid bilayer. And let's say that this layer of the phospholipid bilayer is facing towards the environment, and this is my other side. This is kind of covering. If this is the outside environment where there's nothing but water and liquid-like substances, remember these heads are hydrophilic. They like water. So things that are hydrophilic and hydrophobic pass through them a lot differently. So how this works, hydrophobic molecules, what they'll do is they'll squeeze in between those lipids and they'll go towards the tails, which are also hydrophobic. So they squeeze through, they don't want to be in a liquidous environment, so they try and get away from that. So they'll pass through, they do not require any sort of energy. They'll pass through those hydrophilic heads and go towards an area of lower concentration. Again, you also have those smaller molecules. These smaller molecules, again, will squeeze very tight to fit through those lipids. Some good examples of these types of molecules that I'm describing are like oxygen and carbon dioxide. So again, simple diffusion is the idea of you're moving from one area to another area, an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. The qualities that these things possess are generally small, hydrophobic molecules. The next type we're going to talk about is osmosis. And osmosis is actually pretty similar to diffusion. It's just a very special type of diffusion. It's so special because now we're just talking about water moving past the membrane. So the diffusion of water molecules across a membrane, it describes osmosis. So osmosis is specific for water only. Specific for water only. Water moves from high concentration to low concentration. So I've been saying this. If I keep repeating myself, please know that it is super important. Water moves from high to low, just like everything else. And the special thing about water, though, is that it will make its concentration equal on both sides. So if it's in an area of high concentration, it'll move until both sides of that membrane have an even amount of water in them. That means you'll have a facilitated amount of water that goes in and out until there's an equal amount. And we are going to do all of these things on a simulator, so you'll see what I'm talking about. Hopefully, I know that doesn't really make sense right now, but water is just special in the fact that it has a lot of qualities that a cell possesses, but if you bring too much water into a cell, it could essentially break the cell, and the cell cannot hold that much water. That is why plant cells have a central vacuole, so they have an extra storage for water. And the last type of diffusion or passive transport that I'd like to talk about is facilitated diffusion. So, believe it or not all substances can pass through the cell membrane. I've just described hydrophobic small substances. Now, there are obviously huge substances that try and pass through the cell. Like we need proteins, we need sources of energy, glucose. And these aren't very small things, these are long chains of carbon. So they need a way to pass through the cell. And many times you'll find that these types of molecules are hydrophilic, they're charged ions, they're large molecules that need help to get through the cell. So water and many other substances cannot simply diffuse across a membrane. So remember, I just talked about osmosis is a special type of diffusion, but water in particular is a big substance that it requires help to get across a membrane. Hydrophilic molecules, charged ions, and relatively large molecules such as glucose all need help with diffusion. The help comes from special proteins in the membrane known as transport proteins. So these proteins help transport items across the membrane. Special proteins that help transport across the membrane. And we have different types of proteins. Diffusion with the help of transport proteins is called facilitated diffusion. So facilitated means to help. So like I said, transporting transporting products across the membrane with the use of help known as facilitated diffusion. There are two different ways that we can do this. One type of protein that does this or helps with this is known as a channel protein. And these form pores or like these tiny little holes in the membrane. And this allows like water and small ions to pass through the membrane without coming into contact with those hydrophobic tails. So remember, hydrophobic tails do not like water. So having water touch those tails is not a good thing. So these little pores allow this like hole-like structure in the membrane that water can just slip right on through without even touching those tails. Another type of protein that is used for facilitated diffusion is known as a carrier protein. These bind with specific ions or molecules and carry them across the membrane. So what happens is these special proteins change the shape of the membrane or change the shape of the molecule, and it allows those molecules to come in just based off of that shape change. And I can show you what that looks like. I have a nice little clip that'll show you that. That is all I have for passive transport. So that is all your quiz is going to cover is passive transport. We will talk about active transport, and this is where energy is actually required from the cell and from other molecules. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me on Edpuzzle.